Hello girls, this is your test review podcast for chapter 18 and 19, Gothic art and Proto Renaissance art. So I'm going to cover some important points from both chapters. However, you should also review your notes, review your worksheets that I gave back to you, also play the Jeopardy on Canvas, and read about all of the required artworks from both chapters. Okay, so I'm going to start with Gothic art. We covered quite a bit. We discussed Gothic art from the early Gothic period through the late Gothic period. We also touched on a few different styles within this period, such as Rayonnant, flamboyant, perpendicular style, so I'll try to review those if I have time. We also discussed how the Gothic style changed from region to region. So we know that it began in France, specifically with the Church of Saint-Denis, and then migrated to England, Germany, and also to Italy. So remember how we discussed the differences between Gothic cathedrals north of the Alps versus Gothic cathedrals south of the Alps. You should be very comfortable writing an essay discussing those differences, and you should be able to cite a couple of examples to illustrate your points. Also covered a little bit of history surrounding this time period. So primarily we're in the 14th century, and a lot of political upheaval was going on. There were also some natural disasters happening, such as the Black Death, such as the Little Ice Age. So think about these natural disasters and what effect they had on the art that was being created during this time. Okay, so the Black Death specifically, can you think of some artworks that may have illustrated some of the pain and suffering that people were feeling from this plague that was sweeping through Europe? Remember how we talked about some specific artworks that actually made Christ's pain and suffering relatable to what the people were actually experiencing at this time. So I would say be comfortable discussing that, and maybe have an artwork or two that you could use as an example for that explanation. Also be familiar with the idea of humanism. That's also really important during this time and really affected a lot of the art and architecture that was being created. Also at the bottom of this screen it says the Gothic style replaced the Romanesque style. So what innovations did Gothic architects make? How are Gothic cathedrals different from Romanesque cathedrals? What innovations did architects make, and how does the look and also the feeling of a Gothic cathedral, being inside of a Gothic cathedral, how is that different from being inside of a Romanesque cathedral? I want you to think about that as well. So we know that the Gothic style began with Saint-Denis in France and was sort of created by Abbot Suger, we learned about. How specifically did he change the plan of Saint-Denis to reflect this new Gothic style? Okay, so think about that. Also, you should be recognizing some important architectural features here, specifically the pointed ribbed groin vault. Okay, so how was this an important innovation? What did it allow architects to do to the interior of the cathedral? Suger also coined this very important term, lux nova, which is French for new light. Okay, because he wanted to incorporate lots and lots of colored stained glass into the interior and exterior of these new Gothic cathedrals. Why did he think new light was so important? How is this symbolic of Christian religious beliefs? So how did it function symbolically, and how did it function structurally? How was Suger and how were these Gothic architects able to include so much of this thin, delicate stained glass into the walls of these Gothic cathedrals. What architectural devices made that possible? I have a diagram of some typical Gothic features that you should be familiar with. I know the amount of terms that you have to know is kind of overwhelming, and I did pick out one or two of them to put on your test, so please make sure that you review this diagram and again are familiar with some of these important parts, specifically flying buttresses. You know, that was another really important innovation that came about during this period. You should be able to recognize those. You should be able to understand why they're implemented here. Also the lancet windows, okay, those long pointed windows, the pinnacles, those pointed decorative pieces that are often on the exterior of the Gothic cathedrals, and of course the different parts of the nave, all right? So the triforium, the clerestory, and then of course the ribbed vaulting on the ceiling. You should be familiar with all of that, okay? So skipping along, Chartres is a required work, so you should be very, very familiar with this structure. Remember how we talked about how parts of it actually burned down and had to be restored. So parts of this cathedral are done in the early Gothic style, while other parts are done in the high Gothic style. Notre Dame in Paris is another cathedral that also has parts that are done in early Gothic, parts that are done in high Gothic. Okay, so that's your aerial view. You also have to know the facade and the portal, so be familiar with all of that. This is another required work, another part of Chartres that you need to know, this very, very large stained glass window with an image of the Virgin and Christ child in the center. The Virgin Mary becomes a very important figure during this time, whereas, you know, in the Byzantine period, it was always Christ as Pantocrator, or the Christ or Christ on the cross. So very few images of the Virgin Mary. And how is she portrayed here? Okay, what is she wearing? What is surrounding her? Remember, one of the practice questions I read to you from the College Board was about the iconography of this stained glass program. Remember, they used the word program, and that kind of confused some of you. So don't let that word throw you off. It's just they want to know, what religious images do you see here? How is the Virgin Mary portrayed? Think about the way this would have looked walking into the nave of Chartres Cathedral, and all of the beautiful colored light would have been filtering in. How was that symbolic of Christian beliefs? This, as I said, is an example of the flamboyant style, which you should be familiar with. This is Saint Maclou in France, and it's just characterized by this very, very decorative flame-like tracery on the exterior of the building. So looked at this chapel from the Westminster Abbey that has all of the decorative fan vaults that almost resemble stalactites hanging from the ceiling. So this is an example of the perpendicular style that was very popular in England. You should also be familiar with hall churches, which were popular in Germany, and you should know that a hall church is when the aisles are the same height as the nave. So you can see that there's really just one level here, just a very, very tall level that is equal in height with the nave of the church. And we touched on German Gothic sculpture. We focused specifically on the Rotgen Pieta, which is on the left, which is a great example of this new type of sculpture, this new depiction of Christ as very dramatic, with lots of pain and suffering. But we did not talk about this tympanum from Strasbourg Cathedral, which is actually in France, but again shows this drama, not as much pain and suffering, but it's still meant to, you know, evoke emotion within the viewer, it's supposed to be relatable to the viewer because of all of these horrible things that were going on during the 13th and 14th century. Okay, so similar effect to the Rotgen Pieta, but not as sort of grotesque as the Rotgen Pieta is. We did not get to this one in class, but I do want you to read about it. It's interesting because we've been looking at a lot of these equestrian portraits. So we looked at Marcus Aurelius from ancient Rome. We looked at Charles the Bald from the Carolingian Empire, who's also on horseback. Now we have a new equestrian portrait. This is sometimes called the Bamberg Rider, and it's from the East Choir of Bamberg Cathedral in Germany. So the interesting part of this is obviously stylistically it's much different than the Marcus Aurelius and the Charles the Bald portrait, but the cool part about this is that the face of this rider is actually a true portrait, meaning it actually looks exactly like the person who's being portrayed. So that's really the first time that's actually happened. So this is an important work of art that you should know about as well. I want to quickly cover some important things in Proto Renaissance art. So we're now in chapter 19, still in the 14th century, and we are now in Italy. Okay, so if you remember, we discussed geographically Italy is separated into these city-states, which often were in competition with one another for who had the best monuments, who had the best architecture, obviously who had the best cathedral. So that's why, you know, we see these cathedrals getting larger and more elaborate as time goes on. Okay. Artworks that I did not get to in class that I realized there are a couple questions on your test about these two Italian sculptors, Nicola Pisano and his son Giovanni Pisano. This pulpit, we'll look at some more pulpits when we get into Renaissance art. They're actually kind of cool because they would be in baptistries where obviously people would get baptized. They were often very ornate, very decorative, and this obviously is no exception. So this is made out of marble. It's 15 feet high, so it's actually really, really tall. Excuse the printing in the background. Hopefully you can still hear me. But what I want to point out about these two sculptors is that they're father and son, but the interesting part of it is that you see a real shift from Nicola Pisano to Giovanni Pisano. Nicola was really, really influenced by classical antiquity, by the art of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So his figures look very classical. They look like they're wearing Roman togas. They look like Greek gods and goddesses. They're also very, very static. They're just kind of still, just kind of sitting there. Whereas the sculpture of Giovanni Pisano, there's a lot more movement. There's a lot more deep carving, so a lot of contrast, a lot of darks and lights going on here. So this clearly shows much less classical influence going on. So you should just be aware of the differences between these two artists and their different sculpting styles. We spent a lot of time talking about Giotto, so you should be really familiar with him and really familiar with his work and understand the innovations that he made to painting during this period. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about him any further. So if you need to review, just make sure you read about him in our book. Know also that his teacher was Cimabue, and we also compared their two artworks, so think about the differences between those two. You should be very familiar with the Arena Chapel, not only because we talked about it in class, but because it's a required work by the College Board. So review that as well. So I'm running out of time, ladies, but the last work that I want you to know is this altarpiece, Annunciation altarpiece by Simone Martini, and be familiar with the international style, which was very appealed to the aristocratic tastes and was characterized by rich colors, deep reds, lapis lazuli, royal purple, things like that, and lots of gold. You can see the whole background contains this gold leaf. So be familiar with that as well. And I will see you tomorrow, so good luck studying tonight.